the milk powder in your infant formula this week, the butter on your grocery shelf, the mozzarella on that frozen pizza. There's better than a 1 in 3 chance it passed through a single country with 5 million people and roughly 6 million cows. A country most of the world couldn't find on a map. And once every 2 weeks, from an office building in Auckland, that country sets the price the world pays for dairy. This is the story of Fonterra, a cooperative most consumers have never heard of, that quietly runs one of the most consequential price-setting mechanisms on Earth. By the end of this video, you'll understand why a dry summer in New Zealand can send infant formula prices surging in Jakarta, why a Chinese government stockpiling decision ripples through dairy farms in Poland within weeks, and why the global dairy market runs, to a degree that should genuinely surprise you, through a single online auction that nobody outside the industry ever talks about. This is Hungry Empire. To understand how Fonterra got here, you have to go back to the late 1990s, not to some grand ambition, but to a crisis. New Zealand's dairy sector was fragmenting. Dozens of regional cooperatives were competing against each other on world markets, undercutting their own prices, duplicating infrastructure, and losing leverage against massive multinational buyers. Nestlé, Unilever, Danone, who had the scale to play suppliers off against each other. The cooperatives were losing, and they knew it. The fix, passed in 2001 under a special act of the New Zealand Parliament, was merger. The two largest cooperatives, the New Zealand Dairy Group and Kiwi Cooperative Dairies, merged with the state-owned Dairy Board to form a single entity. Fonterra was born, and at a stroke it controlled roughly 95% of New Zealand's milk supply. That's not a market share. That's a monopoly by another name, deliberately built and legally approved, because the country decided that competing internally was costing it more than it was gaining. What New Zealand had, that made this consolidation worth doing, was a structural advantage almost no other dairy nation could replicate. The climate in the North and South Islands allows year-round pasture grazing. Cows eat grass rather than grain. The cost of producing a kilogram of milk solids in New Zealand is, by industry estimates, among the lowest on Earth, consistently competitive with or below the costs of subsidized European or American producers who depend on indoor feeding and government support. New Zealand doesn't have a large domestic market. 5 million people can't absorb what roughly 6 million cows produce. So, the country exports about 95% of its dairy output. It had to become a global player because it had no other option. That export dependency, which looks like a vulnerability, became the source of Fonterra's leverage. By the early 2000s, Fonterra was supplying a substantial share of all dairy traded internationally. And dairy, unlike grains, isn't a commodity with 1,000 equally sized producers. The global export market is thin and concentrated. The United States, despite being the world's largest milk producer, consumes almost everything it makes. Europe exports, but European production is constrained by domestic politics and, until 2015, by production quotas. Australia exports, but at a fraction of New Zealand's volume. That leaves Fonterra as, by a considerable margin, the dominant single exporter on the planet for whole milk powder, the processed form in which most of New Zealand's milk leaves the country. Whole milk powder isn't something most consumers in wealthy countries think about. In North America or Western Europe, you buy fresh milk, fresh cheese, fresh butter. But across Southeast Asia, the Middle East, West Africa, and Latin America, whole milk powder is the actual product that ends up in kitchens, infant formula plants, commercial bakeries, and confectionery factories. Reconstituted milk from powder is cheaper to ship, easier to store, and doesn't require a cold chain across thousands of kilometers of tropical infrastructure. When a factory in Malaysia makes evaporated milk, or a manufacturer in the UAE produces infant formula for the regional market, the raw material is almost certainly milk powder, and a substantial portion of that powder traces back to New Zealand. What's most surprising about this story isn't the scale, it's the mechanism. Fonterra doesn't just sell milk powder in bilateral contracts and move on. In 2008, it launched an online auction platform called the Global Dairy Trade, the GDT, which runs every 2 weeks and lets buyers from around the world bid on futures contracts for Fonterra's products. Butter, skim milk powder, whole milk powder, anhydrous milk fat, cheese. The auction is open. The prices it produces are published immediately. And those prices have become the global benchmark. Here's the part that doesn't make sense on the surface. Fonterra designed and runs the auction. It's the primary seller. It also sets the volumes offered in each auction, adjusting supply to demand signals. And yet, the prices the GDT produces have become the reference point that buyers and sellers across the entire global dairy market use to set contract terms. Even deals that have nothing to do with Fonterra, even European or American product transacted entirely outside New Zealand. A single company created the market infrastructure that now prices an entire global commodity class. Whether that's a triumph of market architecture or something worth scrutinizing depends on where you sit. We'll say what most industry analysts tiptoe around. By its structure, the GDT concentrates pricing power in a way that has, according to some economists, no real parallel in other commodity markets of comparable importance. A platform whose largest seller also adjusts the volumes offered every 2 weeks is, by design, not a neutral exchange in the way a classical commodity market would be. And the infant formula price in Jakarta next month will reflect decisions made in Auckland this week. Is that the market working as intended? That's a question worth asking out loud. When China enters the picture, the stakes get harder to ignore. In the years following the 2008 Sanlu melamine scandal, in which contaminated Chinese-made infant formula killed at least 6 infants and sickened an estimated 300,000, Chinese consumers lost trust in domestically produced dairy almost entirely. Demand for imported infant formula surged. Chinese buyers began stockpiling whole milk powder as a strategic hedge. Between 2013 and 2014, according to industry analysts, Chinese purchases of New Zealand dairy product surged so dramatically that GDT auction prices for whole milk powder roughly doubled over the course of that boom. Farmers in Ireland and the Netherlands, watching the same benchmark prices, expanded their herds. Processing plants in the United States adjusted their product mix toward powder exports. A procurement decision in Beijing reshaped dairy farming in Europe. Then China's buying slowed, and the correction was equally brutal. By 2015, whole milk powder prices on the GDT had fallen sharply from their peak, by some estimates more than 40%. New Zealand farmers who had expanded during the boom faced debt crises. Fonterra cut the farm gate milk price, what it paid its own farmer shareholders, to levels that pushed some operations into loss. The vulnerability ran both ways. The same concentration of market power that let Fonterra set global benchmarks meant that when its largest customer pulled back, there was no cushion. New Zealand had roughly 6 million cows and one dominant buyer for a large share of what they produced. Analyst reports from that period kept returning to one detail in the footnotes. Fonterra's farmer shareholders, the actual dairy farmers who own the cooperative, had no real exit. The structure of the cooperative means farmers must sell their milk to Fonterra. The farm gate price isn't negotiated. It's declared. When global dairy prices collapsed, the cooperative's farmers absorbed the loss directly. because their livelihood and their investment in the cooperative were the same thing. The cooperative model, designed to give farmers collective power against multinational buyers, also bound them completely to the fortunes of a single entity. Put yourself in the position of a New Zealand dairy farmer in 2015. You own shares in Fonterra, required by law when you supply your milk. Those shares had traded at prices reflecting the boom years. When the milk price fell, the share price fell, your income fell, your asset value fell at the same time. There was no alternative buyer, no other market to sell into. The cooperative that was supposed to protect you from multinational leverage had become the single point of failure for your entire economic life. What this tells us about the structure of global food systems is something the industry rarely states plainly. Market concentration creates efficiency and creates fragility at the same time. The same mechanism that makes the global dairy trade the world's reference price for dairy also means that when something goes wrong, drought in New Zealand, a trade policy shift in China, a food safety scandal in a single country, there's no distributed system to absorb the shock. The lever that moves prices for infant formula across 40 countries is held in one place. The drought variable isn't hypothetical. New Zealand's dairy production is heavily concentrated in the South Island's Canterbury Plains and in the Waikato region of the North Island. When a La Niña weather pattern brings dry summers to the North Island, which climate scientists project will happen more often, pasture growth slows, milk production falls, and Fonterra has less product to offer at auction. The GDT price rises. Within weeks, buyers across Asia and the Middle East, who have no alternative supplier at comparable price and scale, pay more. The mother in Jakarta buying infant formula doesn't know she's paying a New Zealand weather premium, but she is. Fonterra has tried diversification, consumer brand acquisitions in Australia, ingredient partnerships in China, joint ventures across Asia. Some worked. The Being Mate joint venture in China, a high-profile attempt to secure a Chinese infant formula partner, ended in a substantial write-down after the Chinese company's own difficulties mounted. The lesson, absorbed at significant cost, was that building consumer brand equity in foreign markets is a different business from bulk commodity export, and the skills don't automatically transfer. Will a single cooperative in New Zealand still hold this much leverage over global dairy prices 20 years from now? Comment yes or no. Because the answer shapes what infant formula costs a generation of parents who don't yet know they should be paying attention. The dairy in your fridge connects to a lever most people never see. Every food system does, and the empires behind the labels are never the ones printed on them. Which everyday product should we expose next? Name it in the comments. Your suggestions decide what we investigate. Follow Hungry Empire and watch the map redraw.